Then another question is really, how does this macroeconomic story that we've learned thus far until last week, remember we studied the aggregate demand and we learned what is the origin of the aggregate demand. The origin of aggregate demand is really the ISLM, right? The dynamics of the IS, which is the aggregate spending, and the dynamics of the LM, which is the monetary sectors. Okay. So the second question is that how is the exchange rate playing role in that ISLM models? Okay. So there are two questions there. So let's start with the second question, i.e. the question whether how does the exchange rate affect the story that we've learned in the class so far about the equilibrium of the IS and LM. And this is the charts that kind of explain that question. If you look at the first chart, for example, so suppose there is an increase of the money supply or increase in the interest rate, okay? Not the money supply, sorry, increase of the interest rate. Now, I hope you all still remember why the LM curve is horizontal, right? It's flat horizontal. It doesn't mean that positive slope LM is wrong, no. Let me repeat what I said, I think it was 2 weeks ago. You can still draw positive slope LM, but the reasons why we draw LM curve horizontal, because in many cases, in many countries now, the so-called central bank or the monetary authority, when they conduct monetary policy, what they did is really increasing the interest rate, not the money supply. So they increase the interest rate and then they let the money supply adjust. Okay? Whereas if you have the positive slope of the LM, you increase the money supply or you reduce the money supply and then you let the interest rate adjust. Okay. So anyway, that was the repeat of 2 weeks ago. If you look at this chart, especially the bottom chart there, what happens if the interest rate is increased, then the equilibrium move from A to A prime. And that leads to lowering of the output on the x-axis, right? But that was only the story of the equilibrium in ISLM. Now, since today we are focusing on exchange rate, we try to inject the role of the exchange rate in that story. And the answer is on the chart on the right-hand side. Okay? So that is a chart or a line showing the relation between the exchange rate and the domestic interest rate. So if the interest rate goes up, then the exchange rate also goes up. Now, in this case, going up here means appreciate. Okay? Why? Because here, E is measured as foreign currency over domestic currency. So, by the way, that reminds me, you have to be very careful when someone mentioned about the exchange rate. Sometimes they talk about local currency per foreign currency, like how many rupiah per US dollar, but sometimes they use the opposite one. How many US dollar per local currency, okay? Now, in this chart, basically is the second one. And that is the reasons why when you increase the interest rate, basically you appreciate the exchange rate. And appreciation of the exchange rate in this chart means the dollar over rupiah value is increasing. Okay? So I hope you're not getting confused because sometimes I use exchange rate as a local currency over dollars, but this time is dollars over the currencies. Okay? Now, if you combine these two charts, it's clear. Now you see how the exchange rate play a role in the ISLM stories there, right? And the same thing, what happens if you conduct the policies like this? So in this case, fiscal policy. So if you conduct fiscal policy instead of monetary policy, what you do is the IS curve shifted to the right, okay? And that's the upper left chart. And if that is the case, then the output will go up, because you basically trying to pump prime the economy by spending more, the government spending, for example. Okay. Now, depending on your exchange rate system, that will lead to the question, what happened with the exchange rate? Now, in this case, this is the case where basically interest rate does not change. Meaning what? Meaning the kind of exchange rate system that they are adopting here is basically fixed exchange rate. Because by definition, fixed exchange rate means you're supposed not to change the rate. Okay? And that's why the chart on the right-hand side does not change here. Okay? So that is the case of the fixed exchange rate. Now, on the chart below, that is the story of monetary policy. Because what is shifting now is the LM curve, not the IS curve. So the original equilibrium is point A, and now the new equilibrium is point A prime. Okay? But at the same time, now also the government shifted the IS curve. So in a way, you combine monetary and fiscal policies here. The monetary policy is reflected by the increase of the LM curve, and the fiscal policy is reflected by the shift rightward of the IS curve. And as a result, the equilibrium moved from point A to point A prime. Okay? Now, if that is the case, now remember, every time there is a case the interest rate goes up or goes down, that means you are not adopting fixed exchange rate. Because if you adopt the fixed exchange rate, you're supposed not to play around with the interest rate. Because the moment, remember UIP last week, if you change the interest rate, the exchange rate will change. And by definition, you cannot do that if you adopt the fixed exchange rate. Okay. So in this chart, since we show that the LM curve moves up, that means this is no longer fixed exchange rate, but this is the floating exchange rate. Okay. So I hope you have a feeling about how the ISLM story that we discussed last week and 2 weeks ago has different dynamics now when you introduce the exchange rate. Okay. By the way, the combinations of the ISLM models and the role of the exchange rate is also known as Mundell-Fleming Model. Mundell-Fleming Model. This is the name of two persons basically. Robert Mundell is the first person, and then Fleming. I forgot what's his first name, but Fleming is his last name. Robert Mundell got the Nobel Prize, among others, not the only one, but among others, this because of this model. So, again, to summarize, when you introduce the exchange rate in your ISLM story, which is your aggregate demand story, then essentially you're looking on a model which is called Mundell-Fleming Model. Okay. But notice, I started to slowly, gradually, I started to introduce the regime of exchange rate. Fixed exchange rate versus the floating exchange rate. So later on, we'll discuss a little bit more detail about that. Okay.